Look, this week, the fourth week of the election campaign, just after halfway after all, just lost myself in the mire of the campaign there for a moment. This week's going to be all about economics. That should suit the government, even though there are some difficult issues, because economic management has to be a coalition strength. Now, it's going to get a big lift off again tomorrow because the Reserve Bank is almost certain to give us the first interest rate rise for a long, long while, nearly 10 years, going from emergency lows of 0.1%, a little bit of an uptick tomorrow. So people will be using that to criticise the government tomorrow. But here's Scott Morrison's preemptive response today.
It's not about politics. What happens tomorrow deals with what people pay on their mortgages. That's what I'm concerned about. It's not about what it means for politics. I mean, sometimes you guys always see things through a totally political lens.
They do. He's right. Of course, politicians do a bit too, but the media, it's all about politics only. That's my biggest criticism of the Canberra Press Gallery. Never enough about the substance and the future of the country, all about polls and who's going to win and who's going to get an advantage. The other big issue this week will be this housing policy announced yesterday, where the government will take a 40% stake in some homes. To get some sense out of all this, let's bring in Judith Sloan, the contributing economics editor of The Australian. She writes for The Spectator Australia too. Good to talk to you, Judith. First up, just tell us what sort of an intervention this is for the federal government to be owning up to 40% stake in people's homes. Will this work efficiently, or will this end in tears?
Well, hello, Chris. Look, there have been similar schemes in a number of states, but they end up being very complicated. So just think about it. You buy a house, you've got a silent partner who's like 40%. Then, of course, there are maintenance costs, there are improvement costs. Indeed, if you fix up the garden, you're improving it. And then at the end, when you go to sell it, the government, or taxpayer, I guess, more precisely, gets 40% of the capital gain, should there be one. Now, it's a really, I think, administratively complex thing to do. And the schemes that have run at the state level have tended to be pretty small, as this one has been. And indeed, I had an executive assistant in Adelaide, and she entered into one of these schemes. And we eventually decided that she would have been so much better actually just having a vanilla loan, because in the end, you know, there was a lot of interference. And then there was sort of, she was a great gardener. She fixed up the garden, the house value improved, and the taxpayer ran off with the whole lot again.
Look, if we want to increase housing affordability, don't we need to reduce taxes and increase supply, get rid of some of the constraints on the development of land and the like?
Yeah, well, I mean, ultimately it's a story about supply. So the trouble with all these schemes, and indeed it also applies to the government's First Buyer loan program, is that they effectively pump up demand. Or they, I guess, at a minimum, rejig the timing of that demand. And depending on the state of the real estate market, all that may do is actually drive up prices for first home buyers. So I think we've had so many different interventions, so many different attempts, but actually not so good at the supply side of things, because there are a lot of local governments and state governments and vested interests as well in the supply side of the housing market. But Chris, here's the problem. I think this scheme sounds quite attractive to people, because what it does is significantly reduce the ostensible capital value that you have to buy into, and you have a home. So I mean, you know, 10,000, you probably need at least 150,000 new homes to accommodate first home buyers. So it's a bit of a drop in the ocean, but I think it is politically very attractive.
Yeah, because they like to show that they're doing something about it. Rather than addressing the fundamentals, they have little schemes that show that they care, pretend that they're fixing the problem more broadly. I want to get you on this another issue we've talked about before, and that is the gender pay gap. Anthony Albanese giving the Fair Work Commission a remit to address the gender pay gap. What will happen as a result of that?
Well, I haven't precisely done my homework, but I think, there is lots of references to gender pay gaps, or certainly equal pay for work of equal value, which actually, of course, has been a principle of Australian wage fixation for many, many decades. So it is actually illegal to pay someone who does the same job a different rate of pay depending on whether they're man or woman. So what he's talking about, which has led to lots of problems overseas, is sort of this idea of comparative worth, comparable worth, where you kind of somehow think that someone in an aged care home is worth the same as a plumber or something. It'll be more bureaucracy. I heard Amanda Stoker talk about this. In fact, there's been quite a lot of good progress on the gender pay gap here. But here's the thing, this is the conclusion, and, there's a gender pay gap in places like Sweden, which has the most gender-sensitive policies in the world, which basically says that women prefer jobs that don't involve long and irregular and unpredictable hours, and they tend to not like jobs that involve a lot of travel, particularly because of their family responsibilities. And there is a decrement to that in the labour market. So the smart economists with their figures and models have been able to demonstrate that you actually can explain a lot of the pay gap by simply looking at the preferences of men and women workers.
Personal choice. Thanks for joining us, Judith. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Chris.